Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are on this beautiful planet of ours. Welcome to Sustainability in Your Ear. This is the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society, and I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Thanks for joining the conversation today. Plastic waste is everywhere. It pollutes oceans, beaches, and streams. It packs landfills for centuries. You see only the tip of the iceberg when you encounter dumpsters piled high with single-use packaging and tableware after a lunch rush, whether that's at a cafeteria or your favorite quick-service restaurant. The U.S. alone uses over 100 million plastic utensils every day, most of which are used just once and tossed. Now, universities and businesses are under pressure to ditch disposables and embrace more sustainable systems. But making that transition is anything but simple. Our guest today is Rob Kutner, Chief Revenue Officer at USEFULL. It's a company offering a radically practical alternative, a reusable takeout container system designed for the high volume, fast paced world of college campuses and corporate cafeterias. USEFULL's latest move? They've introduced a plastic buyback program that pays institutional and corporate cafeterias to give up plastic and go reusable. It's a bold challenge to the throwaway culture that defines modern food service. USEFULL's already made waves at campuses like the University of Pittsburgh, Emory University, and the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And the company is expanding into retail dining and new container types, including acai bowls, boba cups, and more to match the way students actually eat today. We'll unpack how the USEFULL model works, what's accelerating adoption, and why the future of takeout might just be container free. We'll also discuss the economics of reuse, the logistics of transforming returned containers quickly to create a circular economy in food service, and much more. So get ready for a conversation about how culture change happens one takeout container at a time. You can learn more about USEFULL at usefull.us. Useful is spelled with two L's, not one, so it's usefull.us. We'll get to the conversation right after this quick commercial break. Welcome to the show, Rob. How you doing today?
Very well. Thank you for having me, Mitch.
Well,
How are
thank
you?
you. I'm doing well. Thanks for joining us. We had your CEO, Allison Cove, on about a year ago, and you've made a lot of progress since then. But I want to talk about the plastic buyback program. What's the big idea behind it, and how does it work on the ground?
Sure. So, I think very basically the big idea is to put our money where our mouth is a little bit.
Okay.
And so, if I kind of go back and tell a little bit of the history of what we've seen in reuse, and then maybe where we're going, can kind of help frame how we got here. So, I would say on college campuses, and I think and I'm sure Allison spoke a lot about that. We focus on college and university market. Reuse really started to show up maybe 10, 12 years ago on
Mhm.
college campuses as an alternative to single use packaging or plastic for takeout. And at the time, the option was really, I call it a Tupperware like alternative. So if you're familiar with Tupperware or things that we've all used in our home, the option was plastic reusable containers, and it was the right idea. It was the right concept. Things were moving in the right direction to move away from single use packaging and the waste associated with it. That then really accelerated come COVID time when, really dine-in options were not possible. And so college campuses were trying to figure out, like, how do we create all of these meals in takeout format for students without going through this immense amount of single-use packaging that's expensive and wasteful and hits the landfill and all the things that we know. And so the concept of reuse really started to take off even further. And we started to see a lot of campuses start to adopt reuse in some way, shape, or form, mainly leaning into what was available, which was this kind of reusable plastic containers, which really just a slightly more robust single-use plastic container. And so fast forward to today, we think there are better solutions from a packaging and material standpoint. There are better solutions from a technology standpoint, and we're trying to help campuses accelerate away from plastic for a whole bunch of reasons that we'll continue to get into. Plastic-free alternatives like we offer. And so one of the biggest things I hear when I'm talking to campuses is, "This is great. We love what you're doing. We're sitting on thousands of plastic containers that are either sitting in a storage room, or or certainly on our balance sheet from a financial standpoint. And so, we launched the plastic buyback program to try and help from an operational standpoint and from a financial standpoint, universities that wanted to make this transition and were maybe trying to figure out how best to justify that from a financial standpoint. And so the concept was born.
So what kind of items are you buying back?
Yeah, so typically there's a few different form factors that we see very broadly that are kind of 3 compartment or 2 compartment plastic reusable containers. So it's usually a couple of different formats that we're very familiar with that are in the market. And so what we'll do with the campus is we will look at what a useful program would look like, and they'd
Mhm.
say that makes sense. This is great. Here's these other containers that we have, and we'd start to get into a conversation about how many and how we could help offer a buyback to facilitate the transition to useful.
So once you get hold of all that plastic, what do you do with it? Is it recycled? Are you upcycling it, keeping it out of how you keep it out of the system?
Yeah, so I mean the first attempt is to recycle it and recycle it locally if
Mhm.
possible. So obviously these schools are all over the US. We're not trying to increase a footprint by shipping them all over. So we typically try to find local recyclers, that can recycle the material and the plastic responsibly. Unfortunately, with a lot of these plastic reuse programs, they defeat the purpose a lot because they're thrown in the trash and in landfill a lot. So if we can mitigate even in a small way some of that making its way to recycling, or in some cases repurposing, there's a lot of different companies out there doing some cool things around that as well. That's the first attempt that we make.
With that background, what are all those plastic utensils and tableware replaced with? Tell us about the useful packaging.
Sure. So for one, we're mainly focused on food containers and cups and mugs for coffee or soft drinks, things like that. Useful is a fully plastic free. We focus on stainless, a combination of stainless steel and food grade silicone are what our containers are made of. We say that the program works kind of like a library book model,
Mhm.
where a student goes to a residential or retail dining facility on campus. If useful is an option, they can get their meal or their drink in a useful container. It's checked out to them. So, a big piece of the success of reuse is around accountability. So, this container is assigned to me personally. It's typically free for me to use, and it's due back to a dining facility after a couple days,
Mhm.
at which point it's washed and recirculated. And the accountability piece of this is really, really effective. And that's how we achieve really high return rates and are also creating all this great data, because for everything that's checked out in a useful container, we know that's one single use piece of plastic or packaging that has been diverted from landfill.
So you report a greater than 99% return rate, which is
We do.
really impressive. But it sounds like to me the blocker for an organization is integrating your tracking system with the POS and other internal systems that they use to track the inventory of the cafeteria. Is that the big challenge and part of the impetus for the buyback program?
Yeah, I think it's one of them. So, we do have a fully kind of turnkey solution where we have our own tracking, we have our own software stack and infrastructure, where if a campus wanted to do this kind of fully independent of their other systems, they could. And we have a dashboard and we have an app and all the infrastructure that a campus would need to have this run independently. That said, a big part of our focus is integrating into the ecosystem, on a campus, and where consumers, students, or faculty and staff, the systems that they're used to interfacing with. And the reason for that is we know that reuse is just inherently less convenient than single use, right? There's no major secret there that, if you go and you get something in a single use container, the simplest thing is for you to throw it away anywhere, versus having something that you're responsible for bringing back. We know
Mhm.
that culturally, it's becoming more and more accepted or understood that reuse and these types of things are necessary. But that
Yeah.
said, we try to bridge that convenience gap by integrating with mobile order ahead platforms, POS systems, kiosk systems. We have, major partnerships with companies like Transact and Seaboard, which is a large campus ID and platform company, and they have a mobile order platform and a kiosk platform and a POS platform. And for students, they get a Transact campus ID or mobile credential. They work in a Transact mobile order ahead platform. And the more that we can integrate into those things where I order something ahead and there's an automatic assignment where it just shows up in a container, the more that we can do things like that, the easier this is to consume, from a student standpoint.
So what I hear you saying is that you create other forms of convenience in order to offset the perceived inconvenience of reuse.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's a perfect way to put it.
When you make this switch, how do you start to report to the institution the impact they're having? Is it, you avoided this many cups thrown away? Is it volumetric? How do you describe that, and how do they use that information for their own purposes?
Yeah, great question. I mean, it is as simple as we use a reusable container versus a single use package. And so that data from a granular level rolls up to, what that impact is on, waste mitigation. So pounds of trash that have been mitigated from going to the landfill, volumes, the volume of water that saves, and kind of an overall, carbon footprint reduction over time. And so that is all the data that we can aggregate and shape in a bunch of different ways that universities use, for zero waste goals, for plastic free goals. And some of that is stuff that they work on in the background as part of a broader waste reduction plan. And a lot of that is public facing. So
Mhm.
that the other really cool part about this is that, there's a million things that a university does that I'll call, back of house sustainability initiatives. And then there's kind of fewer things that people interface with every day. And so
Mhm.
one of the things here that's really cool is that, I know my part, right? I chose a reusable container, or I went to an outlet that uses reusable containers versus single use plastic packaging. And that's a really nice way to kind of engage the campus community. So the way that we kind of pull all that together is we also have a very public facing impact dashboard that we see universities put on a TV screen or something like that when you walk into dining to see. I call it's kind of like the odometer on a car, where you see the miles tick up on the number of containers that were checked out, which is kind of a cool thing.
That's a unique situation. So many sustainability efforts don't have the ability to display the progress of the positive impact to the consumer. And in this case, you get to emblazon the entire environment with that
Yep.
kind of information. Do you feel like at this point that institutions are really leaning into this? Are we approaching a tipping point where you think that the entire university system in the United States, which of course is a very fragmented thing, is going to start to integrate this kind of reuse practice into their daily services?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I talk a lot about reuse in general as a when and how thing for most college campuses rather than an if at this point. So I find most campuses very well understand the why on reuse and the need to move towards something like this. And then it's trying to prioritize the things that are important. And for some, it's really understanding why moving to a plastic free solution makes sense. For others, it's more of a kind of crawl, walk, run, maybe starting with that Tupperware like solution to start because they were on styrofoam, and at which case, like, that is a move in the right direction. And we think that eventually, they'll start to get there. But that's also where I think that, policy and legislation comes in some cases, where we're seeing more and more systems start by banning single use plastic. And we think eventually, that's obviously going to move to reusable plastic and then all plastic.
From a financial perspective, how does this net out for the university? Do they end up saving money overall? And how do you describe that when you're talking about the opportunity with somebody that hasn't adopted useful?
Sure. So, I mean, every case is unique in what combination of materials they're using, what kind of how many transactions they're doing, and what that translates to, their buying habits. Um, but reuse is a cost savings over single-use packaging for sure. And so we try to model this with all of our campuses, and we do a pretty extensive analysis that says, if you're doing this many transactions, in a single-use plastic, you'll save money by transitioning to reuse. And so, a financial driver plus the right thing to do is in a lot of cases a no-brainer, or at least should be. And so we do spend a lot of time on that, because while the sustainability impact and the right thing to do helps, the real pull through happens when you can make a great financial case for it as well.
All the stars have lined up then. What's stopping the mass movement? Is it the culture wars in the United States? What do we need to solve here?
Yeah, change is hard. I start there. And I feel like I've been saying it for 15 years now, because I've been working with kind of mission based early stage startups for most of my career. I started with, or not started with, but I worked with Big Belly, the smart waste and recycling system, worked with that company for almost 8 years. And I answered the question the same way I did 13 years ago, still, is that change is hard. And so it's getting people to understand the why, and then helping them transition to something like this is always challenging. I think in the case of reuse specifically, it is trying to bridge that gap between single-use convenience and what it means for reuse. And frankly, that's one of the big reasons that we're starting by focusing a lot of our time on college campuses.
Mhm.
For one thing, it's a nice closed community where I'm going to go to the dining hall today, tomorrow, the next day. And so the circularity of that makes sense based on my habits,
Yeah.
right? The other big piece of that is the education piece. So when you work in higher ed, you're impacting a segment of the population that's going to work this into their life. And then when they go to their local coffee shop, or a stadium or something else, and they start to see reuse being introduced, it's not a foreign concept. It doesn't feel like an inconvenience. It just kind of feels like the way things are done. And there's, like everything, a time evolution to that.
Change takes time too.
It does. It does, for sure.
Great place to take a quick commercial break. We're going to be right back. Welcome back to Sustainability in Your Ear. We're talking with Rob Kutner. He is Chief Revenue Officer at USEFULL. It's a leader in plastic-free takeout packaging, and USEFULL is offering to buy back plastic serviceware and replace it with reusable packaging, and an entire program that we've just been talking about. But Rob, as you approach these institutions, what kind of trade-offs do you have to think about when you're designing the reusable container systems for their applications? Are they concerned about particular material uses? Are they looking for their branding on the packaging? What drives the design?
Yeah, so USEFULL's unique in that we do design and manufacture our own containers. So we have a whole bunch off the shelf that are, purposefully designed for residential and retail takeout applications. So the biggest thing is like the vessel itself. So what are we serving? Is it a burger and fries? Is it a burrito bowl? Those things, when you're dealing in single use, can be very easily kind of curated for those, and get a little more complicated on the reuse side, because you're there's tooling and you're mass manufacturing something. So it's a little bit of the form factor from that standpoint. On the university side, if there's university concepts, we can do branding on lids and things like that, which are mainly centered around kind of school colors, and less
Mhm.
so around the actual outlet brand. When we start to talk about national brands, it's an entirely different conversation. Obviously, if you're starting to introduce reuse to national retail brands,
Mhm.
branding is important, and every single use container that leaves there is a little piece of marketing for that outlet. And so it's something that we spend some time talking about. I would say we start with university brands because they're a little easier to adopt from that standpoint, but we are seeing more and more national brands starting to consider reuse in a real way. And we think that that's going to be very partnership driven in how we do it. It goes back into the financial piece of this, and how you can make a cost savings case versus single use as well.
The other design issue is the process that the institution's going to have to undertake in order to use the reusables. Do you have to think
Sure.
about what happens after I return a package in the first place?
Yeah, no, great question. So I guess the other reason we talked about why useful is so focused on college and universities is in most cases the operational infrastructure exists, right?
Mhm.
So when you bring back a reusable container, it's collected by dining and washed through. Typically, what exists today is dish rooms and industrial sized dishwashers, and that operation that exists washed, put back on the shelf and redistributed. So in the best case scenario, that operation exists, right? Because it's going to be the lowest impact from an operational lift, from a cost lift standpoint. But that said, a lot of retail operations never considered
Right.
reuse. And so you do need to think about, do we have the dishwashing capacity? That's number one. So
Mhm.
I guess to directly answer your question, dishwashing capacity is always number one, because when you take something that was considered to just go to waste stream and now it's going to come back, need to be washed and redistributed, that's a very different operational thought process for sure.
So based on your experience to date, what makes a university or a corporate campus a good fit for the useful solution? When you walk in, how do you look around, you think this is a fit? What are you looking for?
Yeah, I mean, great question. I mean, for starters, we just start with how we think we can make the biggest impact, right? So
Mhm.
we look at, what kind of volume is happening. And a lot of times, if there's a significant amount of volume and there's a will to try to do something, then there's a way, right?
Mhm.
And so we can back into either making the case for an investment in an industrial dishwasher that didn't exist before, because a $20,000 dishwasher is a drop in the bucket if you're saving that a month. So a lot of times there can be an upfront cost ROI to just upgrading that operation. But you kind of start with what the volume looks like and the desire to make a change. And then, of course, then we get into space, what the flow looks like at point of sale. So I walk in, is it something that the staff builds for me? Do I build it myself? Is it prepackaged? There's a whole bunch of things that go into how we consider what that workflow looks like. But at this point, we're at the maturity where we've seen a little bit of everything, and you probably can't surprise us if we take a walk through a kitchen or through a dish room and try to make it work.
You mentioned earlier we were talking about why people do this as the students, for instance, and you mentioned responsibility, but responsibility doesn't necessarily carry all of the weight it needs to. Moral suasion has a lot to do with this. How do you get the students
Sure.
themselves to begin to evangelize the reuse program? Do you give them any kind of materials they can use to say, I'm part of the solution and not the problem?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So we talked a lot about the reporting at an institution level that we do. We also drive that down to an individual basis as well. So I can go as not just as a useful employee, but as a user when I'm on these campuses, I can go and see what my individual impact is, right?
Okay.
How many containers I've, mitigated from landfill, what that's translated, like I said, to carbon footprint and volume of water use and all that good stuff. So you could call it gamification a little bit, but I hesitate to call it that versus just really understanding what my impact and piece of this is, and kind of, again, front of house initiative. So that's a big part of it. And I also just think it comes down to some of those, cultural and behavioral barriers that we start to break down that becomes generational. And we spend a lot of time with campuses on educating the community on the why, right? And so before a launch, we're doing 3 or 4 weeks of outreach to the students on your university is now a useful university, and here's why, and here's what you can do, and here's how you can make the largest impact. And so you have to start somewhere, but then eventually first years show up and that's their expectation, right?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you have your entire population that came to this school and understands that it does reuse versus single use, so, and hopefully plastic free reuse.
Be really interesting to see your reporting integrated into a larger service that said your overall, your entire lifespan impact is being changed by this kind of activity. And I imagine that's something that'll be possible, particularly with AI, to process all that information in the future. But that understanding that trade-off and creating a lifelong habit of reuse is so critical to where we need to go. Do you go there when you do that kind of messaging, that this is part of changing not just your impact, but the entire world's impact?
Yeah, I mean, we try to make things, and obviously we're a company that's trying to grow as well, and we need to, we need to do that to make that impact. So we try to make it actionable, and sometimes if you paint the picture too large, it's like,
Yeah.
how do you eat an elephant, right? One bite at a time, as annoyingly cliche as it is. So I think sometimes, and going back to your question on the challenge, sometimes it can feel like a big thing, right? And
Yeah.
so we try to make it smaller. And then once we get there, this is not a significant lift, we can get there conceptually, then it's how do we make this a more macro piece of the pie?
Another facet of that expansion of reuse, even within a campus, is integrating with the retail restaurants that are on campus. And that's increasingly happening both on universities and corporate campuses. Can they require those retail operations on their property to use useful?
Sure. I mean, for university concepts, so there's typically on a college campus, there's university concepts and then there's national branded
Hmm.
retail concepts. Most schools start with retail university concepts because they can do exactly what you just said with pretty much unilateral decision making.
Okay.
So they start there, and that's usually a really good place to start, make a significant impact, get the university introduced to this from a concept standpoint. And then it's a broader conversation with the national brands. But I have seen the level of, receptiveness rise. And so it becomes here's what we'd like to do, and how do we collectively make that happen?
Is that also your foothold to begin to enter the broader retail and particularly quick service restaurant industry in the future? And how do you get there if that's not something currently on your plan?
No, it absolutely is. And so
Okay.
it's a very tactical decision to focus in colleges and universities, get that foothold, maybe get that foothold with national brand A on a campus, and then start to, elevate that conversation to other areas that this can expand into. When you look at reuse, you kind of look at either closed community or open community. And so
Hmm.
closed community, obviously college and universities, but you can also look at corporate campuses, you can look at certain healthcare systems. So there's a lot that we can do in there that we will continue to grow into. And then you start to look at, okay, well, then how does that look in open community? And that's where, I like to talk about it as kind of public private partnership. And so
Hmm.
it's private in that it's the retailers in this open community need to be bought in. It's public in that town, that county, that state needs to be bought in some way, shape, or form to how this operationally looks. And then the other private being, a company like Useful that has expertise in, how a reusable program can work best.
And in these early conversations with retail brands, what do you find is motivating their curiosity? Is it the saving money? Is it to attract more customers based on the fact that they're working to reduce the impact on the planet? Is it meeting their sustainability goals? What gets the conversation past the, oh, reuse, tell me about it question?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, the almighty dollar as a starting point helps for sure. I mean, that's the priority number one, is to to sell whatever they're selling and as much as possible. And so, and at as high a margin as possible. And so in most cases, the case for moving to reuse from a financial standpoint can be really, really good. We can save as much as 50% over some of the single use packaging that some of these retailers are using. So that's certainly number one. But increasingly, there are sustainability goals that they're getting more and more serious about. We see greenwashing attempts it just doesn't really fly anymore. And so
Yeah.
I think the level of seriousness on trying to achieve something versus checking a box has changed and has started to shift.
The difference in the two scenarios we're talking about, university and retail, is the cadence with which people visit those locations. Have you thought about how to use, for instance, loyalty program tie-ins to the tracking of the materials that you're dispensing to get people to, let's say, hypothetically, come back to Chipotle with their bowl and have it refilled?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a very basic way to start, where I think if you ask most people that do any sort of commuting, they go to the same coffee shop in the morning every
Oh, yeah.
morning, right? They go, they use their order ahead app, they pick it up, and off they go. I take the train into Boston, into our office. I see the same 10 people in line
Yeah.
every morning, and so it's not a big jump for there to be a reuse program there for people that are going to the same place. And sure, that's open community, but it's kind of closed behavioral from that standpoint. And so I think there is low hanging fruit there, where if you can do that, and I think that there are companies that are trying or dipping their toe in the water to get there, then that can expand.
It goes back to crafting an end-to-end experience and reinforcing the value over and over as you first become initiated to it, but then really buy into it and
Yeah.
see the benefits. Do you help consumers lobby organizations to undertake reuse practices? And how do you do that, if you do?
Yeah, it's not something we spend a lot of time on today. We do speak to, a bunch of, nonprofit and lobbyist groups that are mainly focused on reducing plastic from the waste stream. That's obviously a big piece of what we do. So we do some of that. There are a bunch of companies in the ecosystem that we speak with quite regularly that are trying to do community-based reuse programs, and we try to help where possible. But I think the very basic strategy, at least for me, is looking after, sales and marketing and partnerships, is to, to win one university at a time. And that is a big segment of a population that we can influence and then send out into the world to say, why is there not a reuse program here at the coffee shop? Okay, there's a bring my own mug program. Sure, that's pretty widely adopted at this point, but what if I don't have my own? I don't want to use the plastic cup, or I don't want to use the single-use cup. I kind of keep going back to earn the right to have the next conversation type of thing.
Again, great experience is the key to unlocking that relationship and really building and maintaining it. Useful's got a lot on its plate, and that's a reusable plate. What's next? Where are you headed?
For now, we're busy on college campuses. There's a lot of them, and there's plenty that we're not on yet. So we're spending a lot of time there. We're spending a lot of time on the ecosystem partnerships. So, like I said, the way to make reuse, really grow at scale is to make it easy and end to end. And so we're spending a lot of time on that. And then I think the natural progressions, like we talked about a bunch, are starting to be in some of the other closed communities, starting to trickle its influence into open community settings. So I think that's the kind of general roadmap at this point.
So how can folks follow the story? And if they wanted to find a cafeteria to see it for themselves, where would they go?
Yeah. So for one thing, follow us on, I think my team's most active on LinkedIn with all of our success stories. And I've got a phenomenal marketing team that does a ton of content on things to think about, why we try to educate as much as anything, not just be salesy, and, explain what microwave safe really means, and explain why microplastics, making their way,
Yep.
into your body should be a major concern right now. So we spend a lot of time on that. And so, LinkedIn or our socials are a good place to start. But we also, if you're ever on a college campus, it's not exclusive to students. So you can download the
Right.
Useful app. You can go get something checked out to you, use the app to find a return station, use the app to find an outlet that's using Useful. There are ways to interface with what we're doing or other reuse companies, because there's a lot of activity in this space at this point.
Well, Rob, thanks very much for sharing the story.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I appreciate. I know we've been on a couple of times now, so appreciate you highlighting Useful and very much appreciate the time.
Well, come on back and tell us about the progress as it continues. So thanks very much.
I'd love to. Thanks, Mitch.
Welcome back to Sustainability in Your Ear. And you've been listening to my conversation with Rob Kutner. He is Chief Revenue Officer at the reusable food service packaging and technology platform company, USEFULL. It's being adopted by university campuses and can support the next generation's desire to reduce its environmental impact at cafeterias and retail outlets. So take some time to learn about the system and USEFULL's team and history at useful.us. Useful is spelled with two L's, not one, useful.us. Reuse is a necessary practice if we're going to bring society back within the planet's carrying capacity for life, for human life, and for life across the planet. In 2025, humans exhausted nature's carrying capacity on July 24th, or Earth Overshoot Day. We can push that date out to later into the year by avoiding the use of single-use landfill-bound packaging. But reuse is just one of many steps that we need to take. And Rob's frank acknowledgement that reuse is inherently less convenient than using something once and tossing it in the trash is important to note. The benefits of that extra effort are tangible. We have to surface that for people, help them understand that the energy we expend bringing food service items back for washing and reuse outweighs the energy expended and emissions associated with that of plastic food packaging. It's a matter then of making reuse as convenient as possible, but telling that story and finding the right incentives to encourage people to participate. In bottle deposit bill states, return rates are substantially higher, sometimes over 65, 70% for PET bottles. We need to think about the same kind of incentive system across the economy, not built in as regulatory charges, but built into the business of making these systems available at an affordable and economic price. College students will be able to set the course for their generation by taking those extra steps necessary to keep materials in circulation at the universities where Useful is being used today. It's focused on the convenience gap, as Rob explained, and many industries can learn from Useful as we increase our reliance on reusables. So check it out. The key, of course, is to develop an ecosystem. And Useful's reusable packaging would not be viable without the tracking systems, the integration services, the local washing and inventory management capacity that it brings to solving a campus's reuse challenge. Rob reiterated what we've heard over and over, that the effort must produce positive results at the bottom line. ROI, as Bain and Company reported recently, has become the driving force for growing adoption of sustainable practices. Now, note that I said sustainability efforts are growing. They're not shrinking in the face of the current assault on the practice by the federal government, because companies now recognize that the threat to future business performance represented by the take, make, waste economic model that exploded onto the scene in the late 20th century is a path to destruction, to financial destruction. So starting with simple steps, not grandiose and unrealistic promises of revolution and process, can make the path tractable, attractive, and manageable for companies in any industry. And those are the first steps that always require finding partners, standing up new supply chains, new logistic capabilities, and so forth, by developing a financially sustainable business model through experimentation. That is the way that we blaze the trail to reduce waste, reduced extraction of natural resources, and improved customer satisfaction while turning an increased profit. So we're going to keep an eye on Useful, and of course, we're going to explore other reuse strategies. Stay tuned, folks. And I hope you'll take a moment to check out the more than 500 episodes of Sustainability in Your Ear that we produced to date. Writing a review on your favorite podcast platform will help your neighbors find us. Folks, you're the amplifiers that can spread more ideas to create less waste. So please tell your friends, family, and coworkers that they can find sustainability in your ear on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or whatever purveyor of podcast goodness that they prefer. Thank you for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Sustainability in Your Ear, and we will be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.